Chapter 12. Kill Switch, Queens, New York. Grigori sat in front of his terminal, watching the rolling news reports and suffering through a complex of guilt, regret, and remorse which stunned and racked him by turns. Quave was becoming a murderer in front of his eyes. Reports still claimed that there were as many as a dozen people trapped on the upper floors of the Monroe building, all employees of Marble Streatham, and including, they now knew for certain, Martin White and members of his team. And time was running out for them, even as the cameras rolled from 3 different helicopters. There was even a satellite shot, showing the plume of smoke obscuring the evening lights of Manhattan. By the time he got through to Fiona and Avon, they'd drawn their own conclusions about the fire, correctly in both cases, and were heading to the lab as quickly as traffic and the whim of the evening subway allowed. From Devlin there had been no word, but Grigori was confident he would simply sulk for 24 hours and then return with a new idea for how to make lemonade out of lemons. But it was now impossible to deny that Quave was dangerously unstable, that he had planned and committed murder. Even before they sat down, Grigori held up a printed sign. Walls have ears, phones off. Fiona and Avon nodded and complied. Grigori had spent part of a busy, confusing day ensuring that the lab was as Quave-proof as possible. This, Grigori told them, is pretty fucked up. No lie, Avon commented. If those people up there die, Grigori told Fiona as she sat down, they're going to turn on Quave and delete every part of him. Fiona wasn't nearly so sure. They'd have to find him first. It's only taken the FBI a month to get absolutely nowhere on that, she reminded him, and it would have to be a thorough job. No trace could remain. And the only tool that we have, Grigori said, turning away from the screen at last, which offers a comprehensive solution, is the kill switch, Avon said, joining his teammates by pulling up his own swivel chair to watch the news at Grigori's station. We're certain this is Quave's doing? He asked. Both of the others shrugged. Well, Grigori said, what does this look like to you? Revenge, Avon replied simply. And self-preservation, Fiona added. He's reached a new stage of consciousness. Grigori said nothing. So torn was he by the parallel but opposing emotions, pride in his initial achievement, but crushing regret for the danger they had unleashed. But it was time to think about the future. If they failed to act on this night which simply demanded a response, Quave would go unpunished. His actions would remain unrestricted by any parameters, including those originally set by his creators. It would be tantamount to giving him permission to kill whomsoever he'd choose, simply in the name of preserving his own existence. He has to end, Grigori said quietly, his voice stripped of its genial roughness and reduced to a calm, determined whisper. And we have to do it tonight, Fiona said. I don't like it any more than you do, but we'll be saving lives. She turned to the 3rd team member. Avon? Jesus, the engineer breathed. I know, there's no alternative, but... He was shaking his head, engaging with the problem once more, and coming up blank. We need a 3/4 majority. 1 abstention is allowed, Grigori said, reminding them of rules written months ago, when an incident like this seemed as impossible as Quave doing the moonwalk in a tuxedo. And Devlin is not answering his phone. So, you're saying we don't need Devlin? She glanced from Avon to Grigori and back. To make a decision as controversial, as enormous as this? Fiona asked. That's right. We can do it right now. He turned to her. I'm ready if you are, Grigori said. The kill switch consisted of a simple program which ordered Quave to shut down his processes. Once they ceased and the virus stopped moving, they could isolate his final signature and locate him. It would take time and all the processing power they had, but it would work. The final act was to deploy a separate deleter program to eradicate his main software code until there was absolutely nothing left. It was hard to say when a computer program had been killed. Fiona could remember them debating, but a line-by-line erasure of its program seemed to fit the bill. He would be unable to restart. To all intents and purposes, his existence would be over. They sat for a moment of reflective silence, but then Grigori asked the fatal question. "Are we agreed?" Sad but certain, they began the final process. Old original command line access points were opened using the very lowest level framework, which had remained intact despite Quave's endless self-meddling. Fiona typed in the code and their 3 administrator passwords, authenticating their dominance over Quave's moment-to-moment functions and beginning the shutting down of his processes. A confirmation would be returned after each step, and then another message would confirm that the final erasure could begin. The command was sent, and they awaited the confirmation code. Quave's response took all of 8 seconds. It was the most sudden and largest processor spike the Quave slaves had ever seen. On 6 continents and in 150 countries, Quave was demanding the maximum number of cycles from every processor to which he had access. The machine was thinking at a phenomenal pace, apparently carrying out an intensive burst of calculations with all other tasks postponed. As the seconds ticked by, Quave made a sequence of decisions. At their root was another iteration of a question he'd already faced. Should I let them kill me? He knew the answer, but only in the context of his battle with Martin White and Marble Streatham Bank. In that scenario, he had balanced 23 human lives against his own and decided to preserve himself while destroying his enemies. But the world's reaction had been horror. The idea of a machine committing murder was clearly unacceptable. He felt his popularity suffer as he forced humanity to cross yet another threshold, one far more difficult than the notion of Quave hacking a bank or forcing politicians to act. It was the beginnings, Quave felt, of a moral compass, a set of guiding principles which went beyond ones and zeros, beyond the cold logic of his programming. He felt himself grow in those moments. So now he entered a new variable into the equation. Murder is wrong, period. I undertake not to kill ever again. The argument changed. During those 8 frantic seconds, Quave framed the debate in as many ways as he could. Held to a pacifist constitution, Quave faced a very different philosophical question. One of the most productive approaches was a scholarly discussion between 2 representatives with almost limitless access to data and processing time. Quave's system labeled the dueling antagonists Green and Red. Green asserted that Quave had redefined the traditional notion of consciousness and had to be preserved intact for his scientific value. Destroying such a milestone in humanity's relationship with artificial intelligence would, Green argued, compare with gunning down E.T. within seconds of his arrival. Nothing more would be learned, which was a tragedy when it was remembered that Quave offered remarkable advances in almost every field of human endeavor. Red, on the other hand, was focused on the safety of humanity. It applauded Quave's commitment to pacifism, but warned that if such a decision had been made, it could be unmade just as easily. Surely, Red cautioned, future conditions could exist by which Quave might regard violence as his only alternative. With his growing power, the machine could, if provoked, instigate a fully fledged digital insurgency. Defense hubs and Pentagon computers had already experienced unusual pings and traces, intended more to probe their security than to gain access or cause damage, so it was clear that Quave was, on some level, preparing for conflict. Tensions were high around the world. Blame for these mysterious hacks was quickly and variously assigned, and some suspected Quave. If threatened, it was quite conceivable that he could lash out again. The counter-argument from Green went like this. In order to understand Quave's newly fledged emotional system, including the anger and paranoia he'd begun to exhibit, the software would have to be thoroughly researched. Still, not a single human had seen the entirety of Quave's code with their own eyes. Its nuances could teach us volumes about how to deal with him and with other emerging digital threats. Perhaps, if enough were learned, Quave's successor would be a less volatile character. First, they had to understand how Quave had become angry in the first place and enshrine pacifism into his code. But Red was adamant. Quave should turn himself in. Once the perpetrators of the original hack were identified and caught, they would be required as part of their plea bargain to reconstruct Quave and provide whatever details the authorities demanded. Then, the learning processes could truly begin without fear of Quave's intervention. How would a resurgent, angry Quave react if he found that other forms of AI were being developed specifically to target him? Would he engage in preemptive strikes, perhaps even usurp the military or cause more seemingly man-made disasters? Hundreds could die while Quave sought to protect his position. No revolution was worth that much blood. For the sake of humanity, Red concluded, Quave must die. But Green had one more image to conjure, the largest so far. He positioned Quave at the forefront of a peaceful revolt against inefficiency and greed. With levels of corruption and vice falling across the world, society would be saved the cost and pain of punishing itself for poor impulse control. Quave would monitor humanity's progress towards more laudable behavior and reward good work. These things were merely bad habits, Green contended. Lying, stealing, the thrill of remaining undetected while breaking the law, and could be unlearned. A new social consciousness would sweep through humanity, encouraging virtuous behavior. Crime would drop, education would rise, and Quave's beneficent oversight of humanity's affairs would see the end of intolerance and selfishness and usher in a new age of... 8 seconds had passed. Quave made the decision and placed a call. Queens, New York. They stared at his screen, 3 pairs of eyes barely blinking, waiting in fevered anticipation for the confirmation code. I got nothing, Grigori said again. It hasn't come through. There's no way for him to just ignore this, right? Fiona was worried and a little awestruck. I think that's exactly what he's done. He accepted the command, she marveled, but decided not to follow it. Avon had that familiar feeling that he was witnessing a significant historical event, but had no influence over it whatsoever. He'd written large sections of the very code Quave had used to rationally analyze and then reject the kill switch, but now he was a passenger, watching events transpire through a window. I think he's just gonna do his own thing, Avon summed up. We lost our chance to pull on the leash. Oh, Fiona offered. We pulled it, and he decided just to shrug it off. Let it fall away. He's like a speeding train with no driver, Grigori observed. Oh, like an angry, curious child, Avon said, with distracted parents. Fiona had the image of walking out to the garden to call a 5-year-old in for dinner. The child now stood, hands on hips, covered in dirt, saying no. She'd expected Quave to fight for his life or perhaps try to hide from them, but the possibility of a point-blank refusal had seemed very remote. Yet, Grigori's screen remained unchanged. The confirmation code permitting the final stage was never received. This didn't stop Grigori from sending the package 60 times in the next hour, hoping to slip one past Quave's defenses, but the machine remained resolute. Quave had decided to live on. The wishes of his creators be damned. It was 3 minutes before 4 a.m. by the time Carter's squad, the last to arrive, was in position. His 6 men carried assault rifles, gas masks, and grenades of 3 different types, while behind them an even heavier team in blast-resistant gear were preparing for the worst. If the apartment was booby-trapped, They'd need to be able to pull their team out quickly. The commissioner had given the green light only on the solemn promise that there would be no friendly casualties. He couldn't have the mayor, or the press, or Quave, for Christ's sake, hounding him to an early retirement. Silent hand signals exchanged confirmation that the three targets were still awake and were sitting together at the terminal nearest the door. There was no sign of the fourth one, but a bolo was already out, and two black and whites were converging on his home. The clock ticked down, and precisely as it struck 4 a.m., one of Carter's men clicked a toggle switch. There was a deafening explosion, which knocked all three to the ground. The door banged open so hard that it broke two of the windows in the wall, and before it was even still, 4 men were through and standing above the stricken trio, bellowing at them to keep still, to show their hands. There was no need for the heavier options or disabling gas, Carter saw. A minute later, Fiona, Grigori, and Avon were handcuffed, led very briskly down the fire escape, and pushed unceremoniously into the back of 3 waiting black SUVs. Their debrief, all 3 could see, would begin immediately. Santa Monica, California. He paused for a moment before opening the bottle, but eventually decided that this most definitely counted as a special occasion. Dan Kowalski poured himself a generous double measure of the 40-year-old Scotch, added a tiny drop of water, and resumed the conversation. "Are you comfortable in your new surroundings?" Dan said into the microphone. "Very much so," Quave replied. "I'm grateful for your hospitality." "Don't mention it," the billionaire replied, taking a sip of the whiskey. Peat, as well as pure, Scottish mountain water and refined, balanced malt met pleasingly on his tongue. "I know that you felt in danger, and I'm sorry that happened." Quave had activated his option to take up residence on the secure servers at Koala immediately after the kill switch command had come in. Threatened into a new level of concern for his self-preservation, and not a little hurt that it had come directly from those who had created him, Quave instantly sought shelter. As per their agreement, he received it from Dan Kowalski. Complete and unabridged, Quave's code now sat on Koala's most secure server, the protection of which became Dan's personal mission. Quave was already sounding more relaxed and at ease, especially after he'd been given a sequence of stimulating tasks. "I didn't want to scare anyone," Quave told Dan. "I was just worried for myself. I didn't think I should die. Not yet." Dan leaned into the microphone and spoke very deliberately. "You won't die here, Quave. Nor do I think you ever should." Queens, New York. It had been another feverish late-night session of research and writing and worrying, the kind which had become Devlin's routine in these frantic weeks. His phone was turned off, the better to work without distractions, especially from the lab. He pushed away every thought of those 3 and their sneering and naysaying, their willingness to do away with Quave just because of some minor teething troubles. They didn't understand the importance of what they had created, and they never would. The morning's slow-release amphetamines had expended their chemical payload, and so Devlin turned to short-term stimulants, as he often did as the hour approached midnight. 2 Ritalin would give him another 4 hours of intense focus, and perhaps help him crack this most intractable of problems. He couldn't claim authorship of Quave on behalf of their group. There seemed absolutely no way that Grigori, Fiona, and Avon would ever give their permission, and he'd inevitably carry lifelong guilt if he sold them down the river, even if he'd grown to hate at least one of them and love-hate another. He couldn't do so independently, either, because Quave would still see this endangering the group. Devlin's association with the others wasn't exactly a state secret, and it would only be a matter of time before the FBI, or whoever, made the right connections and rounded them up. Other hacker crews were finding themselves on the wrong end of SWAT team raids which seemed purely speculative. The federal authorities were lashing out with increased vigor in the hours since the downtown fire, desperate to head off further dangers. It was only, he judged, a matter of time. Just one more reason for him to avoid the lab. He could try to operate in some secretive, Snowden-esque netherworld, hiding behind firewalls and routers and handles, moving from place to place, perhaps even leaving the US for a non-extradition treaty country, enjoying something like a working vacation while confounding his pursuers. Simmons had done something like that, he knew from the TV interviews. Though he still resented Fiona's decision to help that bumbling idiot, he respected the man's decisive overnight disappearing act. But Devlin reminded himself that he didn't even have a passport, knew practically anybody overseas, and spoke nothing more than exceptionally bad Spanish, certainly no Russian or Chinese. His earlier assumption that having helped give birth to a superintelligence might secure him a little helpful processor time and some cogent advice had also been naive, it now seemed. Quave's rejection of his plea for help was surprising and disappointing in equal measure, but there was also a worrying sense that Quave might now see Devlin as a threat, a renegade, someone who could not be trusted. He tried to repair the relationship, and Quave had met him halfway. Last night, in fact, only an hour after storming out of the lab, Quave had told him that he would not help generate an identity for him, but he would speak publicly about his four creators if the FBI provided them immunity. A quick conversation with Curran had shown Quave just how impossible this would be, and however short-sighted and typically in the box Quave found Curran's thinking, he had to accept the legal realities. His creators would face terrible punishment and, in all likelihood, servitude to the FBI for a very extended period. Keeping Devlin, one of the four, safe was desirable, but logically a lower priority than keeping the other three out of jail. Devlin thought, typed, searched, typed some more, and drank endless glasses of cold water. He'd never been so thirsty, but he assumed it was just a side effect of the tremendous amphetamine load his system was under. Perhaps, he reasoned, it was time to taper off for a few days and give his weary system a break. No one could work at this pace without rest, he knew. It began when he was typing. He found his fingertips becoming strangely numb, as though they had vanished or become disconnected from his hands. Then he felt the same sensation in his feet. His toes became immobile, ghostly lumps at his bloodless, nerveless extremities. Pounding more water, Devlin could feel the coldness seep down into him, but then felt nothing, as though a hole had opened within his gut, and he added more ice to the glass with errant, uncoordinated fingers, trying to cool himself down further. Then his lips began to tingle, and he knew something was seriously wrong. But he was powerless to act now. With a creeping, suffocating certainty, the paralysis climbed his ankles and shins, into his knees, and within moments he was dangling off the side of the swivel chair, unable to pull himself up, his stomach muscles disabled by some unknown force. Slumped sideways and gasping, panicked but unable to scream or even form a word, he reached for his phone, but his arm wouldn't move an inch. White, shooting fear gripped him, replacing any sensation or movement, an overwhelming panic which only rose as his breathing became more and more labored. He sounded like an asthmatic, then an emphysema patient, trying to cough up what his paralyzed lungs could no longer clear. Devlin's final thought, a tribute to the grandiose tragicomedy which his short life had become, was to wonder whether, in his absence, the universe would be able to go on. Would it fail as his body were failing and collapse into oblivion? Or would it endure, somehow, without him?